Welcome, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the Evaluating Your Equity Program webinar. My name is Isabel Kingsley. I am the Research Associate for the Office of the Women in STEM Ambassador, hosted at the University of New South Wales. I just want to start by acknowledging the owners of the land that I'm meeting on today, which is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney in Redfern. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that welcome to anyone who is joining us who is Aboriginal or Torres Strait. Torres Strait Islander, and also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that you are joining us from today. We have people joining us from all over the country, and I asked you some questions when you registered, and it was really interesting to see that we have people who are program managers, people from HR, we've got founders and CEOs, we have people from universities, outreach and education programs, business, broadcasting media, government, the energy industry, the health sector. We have people from all sectors all over the place. So welcome, everyone. I just want to start off by telling you that just a few housekeeping things that I need to let you know. First, we are recording this session. So this session is being recorded so that we can then make it available for anyone to watch at any time. If you have questions during the webinar, please ask them via the chat. We are expecting about 100 people to join us. So just pop your questions in the chat. My colleague Clara Gomez will be sending me your questions. So make sure you pop them in the chat. I know that some of you have already submitted your questions when you registered, and we will make sure that we will address those as well. We'll also be using an app called Slido for a little bit of interactivity and to do a few demonstrations and chat to each other. So I'll give you those details in a little bit, but you can just use your phone or just pop open a tab on your web browser and go to slido.com, and we'll be using that throughout. Now, I want to introduce you to Professor Lisa Harvey-Smith. Lisa Harvey-Smith is the Australian government's Women in STEM Ambassador, and her role is to advocate for women in STEM, but women more broadly, and to drive cultural and systemic change to achieve gender equity in STEM and just more broadly here in Australia. Welcome, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Isabel, and good morning, everyone. I'm joining you from Muanina country. I just wanted to very briefly introduce this topic before we dive in. We don't want to be too many talking heads, so nice and interactive, and we'll get to a lot of questions later on. Just to introduce myself, I was appointed by the Australian government as the Women in STEM Ambassador in 2018, so I've been in the job just over 3 years now. The office that I've set up with this funding has been really tremendous, and you know the leaders within the office working on very different areas, from research to evaluation to our FGU campaign for young Australians to try and help people understand the breadth and depth of STEM careers, and also reduce barriers to equity and participation in STEM. And another role that we have is to advise the Australian government on programs and interventions and you know different investments that they can make to try to reduce barriers to participation. So in this vein, we've worked with the community for a long time, and people like you are doing a tremendous job in actually working on the ground to make this a reality. So what we're trying to do is to help you by providing some information and also some tools that you can use to try to evaluate programs. In other words, to figure out what's working, what isn't, and what we should spend our time doing. And then we can use that information to collate what works and use that to help people who fund us, governments, private sector organizations, to convince them to give us money for the things that are working. So really, we're building a community of knowledge based on all of your experiences, but hopefully we're in a position to just provide that platform and that information to help us evaluate better. So this work's being led very ably by Isabel Kingsley, who's just finishing up a PhD on evaluation of education programs. So it's in great hands, and I'm really glad that you've joined us today. And I'll hand back to Isabel now for the rest of the show.
Thank you, Lisa, for that. And we'll be seeing Lisa again in a little bit. The way that we're going to run this is I'm going to go through some of the evaluation resources that are available and the process of evaluation, but we are keeping the full second half of this webinar for your questions. And like I said, a lot of you submitted questions when you registered, so we've collated those and provided responses. So we'll be addressing those, and also just make sure to send through questions that pop up. And we are definitely going to save the second chunk of this for you and your questions. I will just share my screen again. Okay, and so as Lisa was saying, you know, the evaluation is a big part of what's driving, you know, the Women in STEM agenda right now. So evaluation is a really key priority of the Women in STEM Decadal Plan, which is a 10-year plan that came out in 2019 to help us achieve greater gender equity in STEM specifically in 2030. And evaluation and establishing a national evaluation framework is a key part of that plan. It's also a key priority of the Australian government, and it's part of the Advancing Women in STEM strategy and their 2020 action plan. So evaluation is just really important because, like Lisa said, we want to know what works, what doesn't, and what we should be focusing our efforts on. So as an office, last year we decided, well, we're going to address that, and we're going to put together a national evaluation guide to help people evaluate their programs. So we created this guide that was published in December last year. And before we jump into that, I actually want to, I want you to pull out your phone or pop open that tab on your browser and go to slido.com and just put in the code EVAL, E-V-A-L. And the reason I want you to go to Slido is because hopefully everyone can see this on their screen. So Lisa or Clara, let me know if this is not coming through. But I want you to tell me in 1 or 2 words. So 1 or 2 words, describe your thoughts, your feelings about evaluation. And there's a reason why I'm asking you this. So throw in your 1 or 2 words about your thoughts and feelings on evaluation. Need help, learning, confusing, complex, important and complicated, loaded, difficult, efficacy, often misunderstood. Okay, complex and important but hard, really coming through. Excellent. Now, I have to admit that this is not surprising at all. Last year, before I even started writing the guide, I had a consultation session with program owners, and I asked them the same thing. And the same things came out in their word cloud. Hard, daunting, overwhelming, expensive, time-consuming, all those things came out. And then we sat down and I said, well, what would help you make this less complex, less scary, less overwhelming? And they said that they needed something that would take this complex thing called evaluation and simplify it into easy steps. And so with that knowledge, I developed the evaluation guide, and I broke evaluation down into 5 simple steps. So I want to go through those simple steps right now very quickly. We're just going to do an overview, a run through. I'll show you some of the resources that we've developed, and then we'll get into the nitty gritty. So as you can see here, there are 5 steps. There's the pyramid on top. You can see that the 3 parts of the pyramid are interconnected, and they are the foundation that everything else falls from. So we've got define, plan, and design at the front end. That's where most of the work is going to happen, and then execute and share. So let's just quickly run through the different sections. So the first thing that you would do in coming up with or planning your evaluation, and I want to mention actually right now that evaluation, the best way to do evaluation is to embed it, completely embed it from the very, very, very beginning. It's not something that you add on at the end, tack on at the end as an afterthought. You need to be thinking about evaluation from the very beginning when you're planning. So the first thing to do is to define what? Well, you're going to define the problem that you're trying to address with the program or intervention or initiative that you're organizing or putting together. So are you trying to address stereotypes or bias or workplace culture? What are you trying to change? What is that problem that you're targeting? Then you're going to define your audiences. And there are 2 types of audiences. There's your program audience, and that can be employees, that can be students, teachers, parents, whoever is going to be involved, participate, or in some way be in this, touched by this intervention or this program. But there's another audience that we often forget, and that's the evaluation audience. Who is interested in your findings? Who is interested in your evaluation? And that can be your organization, so your executives, your governing bodies, can be your funders and sponsors, government and policy makers. You know, who wants to know whether what you're doing is working and how? Okay, and that evaluation audience is really going to drive and underpin what you're going to evaluate and how. So it's really important to define those. And then, of course, you have to define your goals. And that may seem obvious, but I promise you, so many people forget to concretely define their goals. What are you trying to achieve? What change do you want your program or efforts to create? Okay, and those can be broken down into short-term outcomes, medium-term outcomes, and long-term outcomes or impacts, what we call impacts, you know, the end result, ultimate dream that we're trying to create. Once we've defined those 3 things, then we move on to the plan. So the planning phase. And the planning phase is linked, as you can see from the diagram, it's linked to the define, okay, because they work together. So based on what you want to do, what change you want to create, you're going to then come up with what activities or what things that you need to do to make those happen, to create that change. And when you come up with those activities, it's always good to think about what inputs, so what resources or different things that you have to put into the program, whether it's human resources, volunteers, funds, anything that goes into making this activity or this program happen. And also the outputs. So what are the deliverables? And deliverables or outputs and outcomes are very different. Outputs are the things like services or events or products that will be delivered as a result of the program, but they are not the change that you want to see. They might contribute to the change that you want to see, but outcomes are the change. Outputs are just the things that come out of it. Once you've decided, okay, now this is what I'm going to do with the program. These are the activities or the interventions or the policy changes or the strategies that we're going to do. Now we think, okay, what are the things that we're going to evaluate? We can't evaluate everything. It'd be nice to evaluate everything, but it's pretty much impossible. And if we try to evaluate too many things, we're not going to get that quality. It's a little bit of like quality over quantity. So you really want to focus your evaluation. So you're going to come up with your evaluation priorities. What are the key things that you want to know that you're achieving? And you're going to make sure that your evaluation really focuses and targets on those priorities. And from there, you're going to come up with the markers, what we call indicators or markers that demonstrate the change. Now we're going to think back to the define phase and what we defined as our goals. And you see how it's very interconnected. We're going to think back at our goals. What were our goals? What problem are we trying to address? And that's what we're going to be measuring. So what demonstrates that change? I know it's abstract right now. I'm going to show you some very concrete examples in a little bit, but those indicators are really important. Once we've come up with our plan, then we're ready to move on to designing our evaluation. So how are we going to collect data? What kind of data are we going to collect? What instruments do we need to collect that data? Some evaluations will require an approach and so for example, I'm thinking if you're in an organization and you want to increase the proportion of women in leadership roles, then you probably won't necessarily do a post test or a pre and post test. You might just track things like promotions, appointments, retention of employees, and you track that over time, and it's really just a matter of keeping good records, and so that you can analyze them down the road to see if different interventions make a difference in the proportion of women in leadership roles in your organization. But for other things like outreach programs or education programs, you may need to do things like a post survey or a pre and post survey to know what participants' perceptions of a certain thing are before the program and then again after the program, so that you can measure change. So depending on your program or intervention, there will be different approaches. It's just a matter of what works for you and what your indicators are that you've come up with already, right? Remember those indicators. So based on the approach, you might collect quantitative data, which are like numerical data. You might want to collect qualitative data that can come from written responses to open-ended questions. It can be images, it can be interviews, focus groups. It can be video recordings. It can even be text and content from social media. So Facebook posts or tweets during a conference, anything like that is very good qualitative data. And then what I would recommend is mixed approach, which is getting some quantitative data, but also complementing it with qualitative data so you get that, you know, the concrete kind of numbers, but also the rich, deep insights that you get from qualitative data, which really complement and paint a more holistic picture for your evaluation. One thing that is also really important is coming up with a data management plan. You really need to consider how you're going to safeguard your data, how you're going to collect it, store it, manage it, who's got access to it. Those things are very, very important to consider. And in the guide, there's templates and there's like a lot of detail in how you can go about that. Again, this is a very broad overview. There's a lot more detail on all of those key aspects in the guide. Finally, once we've got our very stable, pyramid of planning and thinking about our evaluation, then the rest will just fall out of it. So then it's just about recruiting your participants. Again, if you need to recruit participants for your evaluation, you may or you may not. Again, if you're tracking employee trends, then you may not necessarily need to recruit participants. You may want to do a focus group to see, to get insights from your employees, and then you would want to maybe send out an email to employees asking who wants to take part in a focus group. If you're running an outreach program, you would want to ask the participants if they are willing to take part in your evaluation. So recruiting participants, and then it's just a matter of collecting the data and analyzing it. Again, there's a lot more detail in the guide. It's data collection can take an hour if you just do it in one go. Or it can take years. If you are tracking things over a long time, it can take years before you have data that's useful for analysis. So it just depends on your program. And then finally, you move on to sharing your results. So important. There was a study by Australian National University last year who found that specifically for women in STEM programs, there were over 300 programs, but only 7 of them had been evaluated and had publicly available findings. That means that is why we don't really know what works and what doesn't work, because people may be evaluating, but we're keeping that knowledge to ourselves, and it's not helping the broader, the broader goal of equity. So sharing our evaluation is so important, and transparency is key. We don't just want to know what works. So we don't just want to know that your program was successful because 100 people attended. We don't just want to know that your program was successful because students enjoyed the experience. We want to know if it made a difference, what worked, what didn't work is just as important. So really not just cherry picking the details that we share, but telling the whole truth. And that's really, really important. There's details in the guide about how to organize your report and your findings to share them publicly. And then, so put them on your website, share them with your stakeholders via email, share little insights on social media, point people to your report. Really sharing these things publicly is essential for us to be able to better understand what works and what doesn't. The guide also has different resources and templates. So one of the things that we found our users, because when we wrote this guide, we got a lot of feedback from program owners. And one of the things that the program owners really liked about this guide is this evaluation planning tool. So it takes you through the top 3 sections in that pyramid in one worksheet. So you define your problem, you define your audience, your goals, and you can see there that the goals really lead into those indicators. They're linked with the arrow. What are your activities? What are your priorities for your evaluation? What is your evaluation design? So you can do that all in one sheet. And people found that very, very useful. There's also other things like templates for your data management plan. There's templates for things like participant consent forms. So all that is available in the guide. The guide is, I know that a lot of you have already downloaded the guide or looked at the guide, but it is available on the Office of the Women in STEM's website. So you just go to womeninstem.org.au, you click on Evaluation Guide, and all of the resources are available here. So you have the full guide, which is goes into detail on all of the aspects of evaluation. You have the quick reference guide, which is exactly what we just ran through, the quick reference guide. So nice little resource for you to just be able to flip through and then go to the guide for more details when you need to. This is just the infographic that you might want to print off and pop onto your wall as just a visual reminder of the things that you need to think about. But what I want to draw your attention to right now is the examples of evaluations. So if you click on this, it takes you to a page where we have 5 examples of programs that have been evaluated. And the project owners were kind enough to work with us to share their process of evaluation. So we've got SAGE, the pilot, the evaluation of the pilot, Champions of Change Coalition. We've got STEM Women, Tech Girls, and STEM Returners. And I'm just going to click on STEM Women to show you the example here. So STEM Women is an online directory to improve the representation of women on boards, on panels, on in conferences or in the media. So you can see here that they've shared their completed and filled out their evaluation planning tool. Everything is there, their indicators, their goals, and then everything that's in this template is just explained in a little bit more detail underneath. So you can see their program audiences and evaluation audiences, long-term, short-term, medium-term goals, their inputs and outputs, their key questions for their evaluation, the surveys that they used are right here, and their report. So you can also, they're very beautiful report. Not every evaluation report needs to look this good, but their evaluation report is there, and it's you know, a good kind of template to use for your own report with the methods and everything explained. So people have told me that those examples are a really useful resource for them in planning their evaluation, but just also understanding, seeing the whole picture and being able to understand how others have done it and how you can go about it. I always say see one, do one. It's a lot easier that way. Okay, so it is time for the audience questions, and we'll bring Professor Harvey Smith back.
Thanks, Isabel. Great stuff. Look, we're getting questions in, but we've already got some pre-submitted questions, which are really fantastic. I think they help us delve a little deeper. So everyone feel free to send in your questions in the chat function on Zoom, and we'll pick some of those, but we'll start with some pre-submitted ones. And look, I like this one because it's sort of extending from the basics to something a little bit harder. But the question was, how do we measure the longer term impacts of a short-term program? For example, if it's with children at school, obviously following the students as they go through their schooling can be tricky. And I noted a question about unique student identifiers as well, and where that's up to. But are there any sort of tips for, you know, more longitudinal studies, perhaps using longitudinal databases online that you can share with us?
Yes, absolutely. This is a question that a lot of people asked, actually. So that's why we're starting with this one. It is so difficult to evaluate long-term impacts, but I'm going to share with you an idea. So in the guide, there is on page 16 a little box that's called Nouns and Unknowns that kind of dives into this a little bit. But we are all doing individual programs, and those individual programs have individual intended outcomes. but all of them are contributing to a shared future, those shared future impacts to equity. And I want us to keep that in mind, because the issue with evaluation and the issue with a lot of the things that we're trying to do is that the impacts may take years or even decades to manifest and to come to fruition. There are also a lot of factors that come into play. And so it's, these factors can affect really how we can link the outcomes from our individual programs and projects to the impact. So for example, how do we know if a one-day workshop or a 1 month workshop with students in high school will lead them to take on a STEM career, for example? They may have all kinds of other experiences that contribute to them taking on a STEM career. So how do we know if our specific program led to that? We can't. It's, the long-term impacts of our individual programs are elusive. They remain largely unknown. So what do? Well, we can look at the short-term outcomes and short-term and medium-term outcomes and go, okay, well, this is what my program changed in the short term. And then we look at the result of our collective as being able to shift that dial. So are we going to have more girls or more women in STEM careers in 10 years? We want to know that by looking at the dial, but I don't know if we can actually measure that all. We can't all individually measure if our individual programs have led to that, but we can look at that dial in 10 years and see if our collective has shifted. So what's the dial? Well, there's a few dials. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics collects statistics, data, and they have things like gender indicators. For example, looking at women's earnings. Are we going to close the pay gap? Well, we may be able to see that in a few years, in 10 years, in 5 years by looking at ABS data. Equal representation of men and women in parliaments in the Senate. That's a dial that the ABS collects for us, and our individual efforts can contribute to shifting that dial. Other dials, there's a STEM equity monitor. And I'll show this to you because this is a really, really valuable resource. And if you're thinking, well, I'm not in the STEM field, that's okay, because it's not just STEM. So it's a very interactive website. It's got, you can see from the contents here, it goes into from education and training to the workplace, everything. So I encourage you to go and have a look, but you can see here that you can look at all industries or you can separate it out. You can look at changes over time. So this one is gender representation by industry, looking at senior leadership and management. So there's another dial. So we're all trying to shift the dial. We can't evaluate the long-term impacts individually, but we can all contribute to that dial. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky, isn't it? And another question just came in saying, what type of questions can you ask that capture long-term impact? And I guess that's the subtlety, isn't it? As opposed to quite commonly, if you do a qualitative analysis at the end of an event, say a survey, and you capture, what's the subtlety there between the types of questions you can capture, and how would someone go about that? I.e., short-term enjoyment versus impact.
Yes, well, yeah. Again, it's very much linked to the objectives of your program. So I'm actually going to show you, because we had a very similar question that was previously submitted, and I did come up with I wanted to talk about the toolkit, but we can do that in a little bit. What you're saying, what you're asking, Lisa, or what this person is asking is very similar to someone else who was asking about basically how do you differentiate between asking what the outcome is or what the change is, and just what the value they see, or did they have fun, or did they enjoy the program? So I see that as outcomes versus feedback. And there's a big difference between assessing and measuring outcomes and getting program feedback. And both are very, very important. So what I'm showing you here is an example from the Tech Girls program. So one of their goals, and you always just have to think back at like, what are my goals? What am I trying to achieve? What am I trying to change? So in terms of assessing outcomes, the goals here were to increase the interest of girls, interest in STEM as a future career choice. So then what we're going to ask them is about their future career choice, and if they see that as an option. And so what Tech Girls did is they used an instrument that assesses exactly that. So you can see that the questions here that measure that outcome are very, very, very specific to that outcome. I plan to use science in my future career. I will work hard, you know, they all relate to that idea of interest in a STEM career. But what's also useful is, and it can be a priority of your evaluation, is to get feedback that's also legitimate, but we shouldn't confuse the two and think that the feedback is also measuring the outcome. So you may want to ask the participants, what worked well, what didn't work well, what did you like, did you have fun? That's fine, but it's not, it should not replace measuring those specific outcomes that are the goals of your program.
Yeah, so I think that's really the main point of this tool, isn't it? To help you at the very beginning when you're designing your program to define very specifically the outcomes, and then you can measure your outcomes against those, as opposed to figuring out at the end, you know, oh, did that meet our outcomes? Well, we never defined the you know, what we intended. So that's going to be really key, isn't it, when people designing programs. And look, you did mention the toolkit, and I don't know if you wanted to explain to people what you're planning for the next stage of this, because I think that's going to be really key as well to where we're headed together as a community.
Yes, absolutely. And that comes back to the question of long-term impacts. And I think that someone had asked, you know, is someone collecting evaluations somewhere? You know, what's going on? And the answer is yes, yes, soon. So the National Evaluation Guide was the first phase of the project. But what our office now wants to do is create an evaluation toolkit. So that template, that evaluation planning tool, we're going to turn into a digital platform. So it will be a platform where you can plan your evaluation, but you can also report the findings into that platform, and it will act as a repository. The elements in there will make it will basically be like a click and drag kind of idea, where you select the different components that make sense for your project, and then when you report into it, you can save that. If you want to leave it as a public evaluation, then all of those evaluations that are on that platform will be publicly available for anyone to browse and look through. And they will all be, very much linked to how the guide kind of uses those steps. I think that will be a really important toolkit, because one, it'll make the evaluations a little bit more consistent and comparable, which is really important in understanding what works and what doesn't and how to improve it. It will also be a really useful platform potentially for funders who want to invest in programs and want to know who's doing what and how it's all working. It will be a useful platform for potential collaboration. There may be a lot of programs that are trying to achieve the same thing individually, but maybe they could all pool together and collaborate. So I think that this evaluation toolkit will be a really useful platform for any equity program. And the plan is that it will be coming out at the end of next year, so 2022.
Yeah, it was certainly a real priority for me, and we were delighted when the government announced the funding for the toolkit in the last federal budget. Because we'd really been thinking, someone in my position as a government advisor, being asked regularly what my advice is on the types of programs we should be funding. Now it's really hard to know that there being hundreds of programs across the country, if they're not consistently evaluated, which ones to recommend or what types of interventions to recommend. And as a scientist, I always try to do that on an evidence-based. However, it's not always possible. So you've really got a platform now that we're trying to create, where people can evaluate in a consistent way. You can share your results, you can learn from each other and collaborate, but also attract funding. And that's going to be really helpful, we hope, for the community. And we'd love feedback on the types of features we'd like to have in that platform as well. And I think that answers the question about how we attract funding in the short term. When it's hard to measure long-term impacts, at least we can measure short-term incremental impacts, which we would reasonably expect would contribute to those long-term impacts, as in shifting the dial nationally on women and girls' participation in STEM. I did want to ask you, Isabel, about ethics approval, because it's quite complex, and maybe people who aren't familiar with social science research, certainly myself as an astrophysicist, I've never had to get ethics approval for studying stars and galaxies, and other people may be in the same boat. So can you explain to us a little bit about ethics approval and some of the subtleties there with program leaders?
Yes, absolutely. There is this seemingly blurry line between needing ethics for research and then evaluation. What's the difference between research and evaluation, and when do you need ethics? And when this question came through, I also thought, I had addressed this in the guide, but I think that it needs to be more explicit. And so what I did was, we're hosted at the University of New South Wales. So I went to the University of New South Wales Ethics Committee and I asked this question to them. And essentially, the long and short of it is that if you ever plan to use the data for research, so to publish in an academic journal or anything like very academic and research, if you ever plan to go down that path, then you need to apply for ethics, because you will never be able to publish your findings in an academic or research platform if you don't have ethics. But if you don't ever plan to use it for research and it's solely for evaluation, and you want to write a report that you're going to share publicly, but a report and not necessarily an academic paper, then you don't need ethics approval. And you can basically only get ethics approval from a university or some kind of research organization like that. So no, you don't need ethics if you don't plan to do academic research with it. However, you still need to abide by very strict protocols and procedures to make sure that you are conducting your evaluation ethically. So I've noted some 5 dot points that we need to consider about ethics. So first, talk to your organization to see if there are any legal requirements or standard procedures for evaluation. Always check with your organization. Follow the guidelines for consent from the National Statement of Ethical Conduct. Okay, and that's in the guide. That's on page 13 of the guide, but you need to follow the National Statement of Ethical Conduct, and that's available on the website. So just go to the guide and you can find the link there. You need to consult the Australian Privacy Act, because you need to make sure that you abide by those protocols. You must get consent from your participants to use the data. So, or even to participate in your evaluation. So anyone who's participating in your evaluation, you need to ask them, would you like to participate? And you need to tell them what you're going to do with the data. Are you going to publish a report?
What about children there? Is it parental permission that you have to get?
Yep, absolutely. If they are under the age of 18, then you need permission from the carer, the parent or guardian. And get that in a written form or in a verbal form, but you need to record that consent. It needs to be traceable. So if someone says to you, did you get consent from your participants, you can prove that. You need to be able to prove that. And the last thing is, if you're working with Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples, you need to you need to look up the Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research. And there are protocols basically around processes of meaningful engagement between the evaluator and the individuals involved in the evaluation. All of this is in the guide, so you can just go in there, and the links are live.
That's really handy for the terminally clueless like myself on these issues. It's certainly a different world from many areas of research in the physical sciences. So it's really good information. So I've got another question just come in. Someone's saying one of the challenges they faced in developing plans for addressing equity issues is understanding what those issues are in the first place. So how do people go about in organizations or a particular field of study or a discipline? How do they go about understanding what the issues are in the first place so they can design an appropriate intervention? Which is a great question, I thought.
Yeah, it is a great question. Often we jump to we'll think, oh, it's a good idea, so let's do it, but we don't really understand the issues of why we need to do something, or if we should be doing something. So it's really important to do a little bit of background research before we start anything, so that it's not just a good idea, but it's actually achieving a purpose, or filling a gap or anything like that. So I mean, doing a little bit of background research. There are things like, for example, the Women in STEM Decadal Plan. The appendices to that plan are incredible, because they lay out the barriers and the problems that women in STEM, for example, or girls in STEM face, and then lay out what's been done, what's been tried, and potential solutions. So doing just a little bit of background research, even just if you're in an organization and you perceive that something is an issue, but you're not 100% sure, do an audit. If you think that there's a pay gap, but you're not sure, do an audit. Look at the remuneration in your organization, and then you will know if there is a problem, and then you can come up with an intervention to overcome that problem.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes tempting, isn't it, to identify a problem. You say, oh, there's not enough girls in engineering, so I'll send some robots to a school with some enthusiastic people, and hopefully that'll fix it. And, it's just got to be a little bit more macro than that, and look at the systemic reasons and the broader reasons, I think, and asking people also how we can support them, in particular when engaging with schools, for example, asking the teachers, they're the experts on what's missing. So sometimes I've been to schools, certainly in this role, and teachers have told me, please stop sending us resources. Like we don't have the time, we don't have the capacity to get more drones or robots, or so it may be that you're not helping the problem if you don't engage. So that's certainly a lot of data in the STEM Equity Monitor, a lot of information in the decadal plan, as you said, and engaging with the people who are the experts on the ground as well. It's a lot of people are doing this stuff, but it's really important to always remember, I guess.
Yeah, you're right. Consultation is so important. And as an example, when we started writing this guide and coming up with these resources, we actually went and consulted with the people who would be using it to know what they need. Otherwise, you sometimes create something that no one actually wants or finds useful.
Sure thing. Look, I think we've probably got time for one more question before we need to wrap up. But I think these probably best to ask a data question. How do you evaluate a program after you've already started it? So what if people are already doing a program? It's probably a great program, but they haven't done this type of evaluation yet. How do you sort of start now when the program's already running and you can't necessarily go through the planning steps?
Yes, that happens quite often. People inherit a program that's been running, and it is harder to start evaluation halfway through something, but it's not impossible at all. And one of the ways that you can collect data, I mean, you may not have a baseline. So a baseline, you may not know, for example, how participants feel or think or what they know about a certain topic. And so it's hard to measure the change. But what you can do is there's a thing called retrospective pre and post. So you can ask people what they to think back at before they started the program. What did they know about the STEM careers and options for STEM careers, as an example? And then in the next question, ask them, now that you've gone through the program, now what do you know about STEM careers and options for you for your career? And it may seem subjective, and it is, but most of anything is subjective, really. But it is a legitimate approach. Researchers use it. And if you don't have a baseline, that may be a good way to kind of show that there may have been change in your participants, for example.
Yeah, it's good to know. All is not lost. And I suppose a lot of people with programs are maybe on, rolling funding grants, perhaps have to reapply for funding quite regularly. So there's always a pivot point as well, an opportunity to pivot what you're doing and adapt according to the types of outcomes that you're looking for and what you're learning throughout the process of running a program as well. So that's great. We're almost running out of time. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about not cherry picking the good, and then perhaps you'd like to wrap up. But just personally, I'd like to thank you, Isabel, for the great work that you're leading in this, and for everyone who's participating. I hope you'll continue a really great engagement with us and help us to design a toolkit that's going to be really useful for you. And I hope you find the evaluation process really rewarding and hopefully financially rewarding as well for your programs to continue with funders when you can prove the great impacts that you're having. So thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. And yes, there was a question about how do you tell, a meaningful story or narrative and not cherry pick, and but cherry pick what you report. And it's, when I talk about not cherry picking, it's more about you don't want to only choose the findings that support what you've been trying to do, or prove your success. So evaluation is not about proving your success. It's about finding out if what you did worked, to what extent, and if not, why. And it's okay to say, well, this thing that I did worked really well because it changed this or it caused this, but this didn't work as well. That's okay to do, and funders don't frown upon that. So yes, you want to be able to create a report that is clear and concise and tells the story of your program and the evaluation, but we don't only want evaluations that show that a program was successful. We need to learn from the things that don't necessarily work as well. All right, I would like you to pull out your Slido app, whether it's on your tab or on your phone. And I want to know, again, describe your thoughts and feelings about evaluation. So pop a word or two in now that we're at the end of the webinar about how evaluation makes you feel or what your thoughts are about evaluation. Not so scary. That makes me very happy. Exciting, structure, possible, important, essential. I'm glad that essential is really big now. Yeah, I'm glad that I was able to communicate the importance of evaluation to you in this webinar. Excellent, excellent. Now you may notice what I'm doing here, because we've just spoken about it. But think back to before the webinar. This is a retrospective pre-post. And I did this on purpose to provide an example of what that can look like. But think back to before this webinar. How would you have rated your level of confidence in evaluating your program? So we're getting 50% slightly, okay, all right. Excellent. Well, okay, good. Now, so we've got about 40% that said slightly confident. We don't have a lot of confidence. Now, at the end of the webinar, how would you rate your level of confidence in evaluating your program? Okay. Fairly confident and somewhat confident. Excellent. So as you can see, I can be evaluating this webinar while I'm doing this webinar through live polls and interactions. So you can be creative with your evaluation. And finally, do you plan to use the evaluation guide and or the resources to evaluate your program? Excellent. Well, with that, I would like to actually, just before I close, if anyone would be happy to provide feedback or advise on the evaluation toolkit. We are in the define and the plan stage of that right now in our office. So we would love to be able to know who we can reach out to find out what would be useful in that toolkit, the different components and elements that you would like to see, or just to get advice and feedback along the way. If you would be happy to do that, pop into the chat and direct message Clara Gomez, not the whole group, but Clara Gomez, and just pop in your email address, and we will keep you in a little database of people that we would like to contact to get advice and feedback from. And with that, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. I hope that this webinar was helpful and useful, and I wish you all the very best for the rest of the day. Thank you.